what we're trying to do here is to create a web-based platform which allows you to search essentially metadata of key housing and housing-related data sources in the UK, and give an explanation of what the data is and where you can find it. And the rationale behind this is to promote effective utilisation of available data, and also look at ways of sharing data and new data methods for analysis. So this is the first version, so our version 1 of the Data Navigator. It's very much a sort of beta version, we're still testing it. But the important thing is that we release it as soon as possible to get user feedback. And we aim to develop the Navigator as we continue with the CaCHE project. And the Data Navigator will also be eventually supplemented by other tools and resources, such as a wiki and a blog. So our remit behind the Data Navigator is an easy-to-use single source on the web that will have information about the key data sources from public and private sectors. One of the issues about housing data is that it tends to be quite broad. There tends to be a lot of it collected by different types of organisations, public sector and the private sector, charities. It tends to have different geographical coverage, different temporal coverage, and it's of varying quality. So what we want to do as part of the Navigator is give you users some idea of who's collected the data, the geographic coverage of that data, how old the data is, and how useful the data would be for housing related research. Have this all in one location. We'd also be promoting new sources of housing data. So data collected by organisations such as Zoopla, for instance, or Rightmove, and organisations such as Airbnb, who've got these new sources of data on the sort of private rental sector and housing markets. So we're providing news on these sort of new innovations of housing data, which go beyond the traditional types of housing data, such as surveys, traditional surveys. We'll also be providing key contacts of who to get hold of if you want to have access to data. And we're also hoping to identify key publications, whether it's academic publications or policy publications, which have used data in interesting ways in previous housing academic and policy research. So we're working closely with data providers. Essentially at the moment we're working with data providers on the sort of open access data that's generally available. Going forward, we'd like to collaborate with industry partners and maybe get access, or at least some form of access to some of their more data which isn't quite as open, but which could be quite useful. So data collected by Rightmove, for instance, or the Royal Town Planning Institute, or the Building Research Establishment. So we'll be negotiating particular types of access to that type of data. We'll also be investigating potential data linkage with partners, such as the big urban data centre in Glasgow, or the administrative data research centres in the Four Nations, or the Consumer Data Research Centre, to facilitate data linkage to other data sets to allow interesting research. And we'll be educating users on data set characteristics, particularly around this idea of data linkage and new forms of housing data. So just so users are aware that there are different types of data sets available which could answer new and interesting questions. So what's been done so far is there's been a data collection activity initially at the start of CaCHE, and that's produced a first list of 150 plus data sets relating to housing evidence and of associated metadata. So we've created a big data set of this, and this is what's populated the first version of the Data Navigator. So this is our starting point. So for instance, there's an example. So here's an example of sort of the private rental sector data, which metadata, which is available on the on the Navigator. So it's the sort of data, if you're familiar with the PRS data, that they should be familiar with. It's data that's generally available, but tends to be collected maybe by different organisations in the different nations at different geographical coverages. So some of the coverages are just for England, some of them for Northern Ireland, some of them for Wales. Some of the data is released nationally and some at local authority levels. So it gives you information on what the data set is, what the geographic coverage is, and the time span of the data and where to get the data from. It does this through the Data Navigator front end, which I'm going to give you a demonstration of soon. Just some technical information. We're using CaCHE as the platform to run the Navigator on, and so the data sets, the metadata sets, are available online, and anybody can grab them as an API if they want to. So we've kept it as simple as possible. We've created a nice, clean looking front end, not too cluttered. And data sets are searchable by word. So it's a really basic user interface at the moment, but we're hoping to update it to meet the needs of the project and also based on user feedback. So this is a typical example of what you get if you search for private rental sector information, and it comes up with the private rental market statistics. So it gives you the geographic coverage. In this case, it's England, and the geographic units for local authority. It gives you some information on what the data is and how it's been collected, and access and usage, whether it's freely available, and who actually owns the data. In this case, it's the Valuation Office Agency, and some other data, metadata records. There's actually more data on this than we're showing here, but we're just trying to keep it simple, and we're going to use user feedback to suggest what sort of extra data you might want to have presented. So this first version is just a very simple, clean version. As we've built it on CaCHE, all the data is programmatically available in a standardized way. So actually other people could build upon what we're doing and build their own sort of API. So the whole idea is that everything we're doing is open and free to use. We've got quite a lot of experience in using APIs. APIs, if you don't know, are basically data feeds. So it's a way that the platform can grab data from different organizations seamlessly and present it online using particular types of protocols. And it's the way that open data is now being presented. And we're also looking at the open data licenses to allow reuse of data in faster and cheaper ways. So we're really looking at collecting and representing open data that's already available. And these sort of standards are being used now by organisations such as the ONS or NOMIS, Land Registry, Stats Wales. So it is an industry standard. So we're making sure that the Data Navigator conforms to industry standard protocols, so we can bring in data as it's released. So before I show you a quick run of the Data Navigator, as I said, it is the sort of beta version. It's the first version, and our next steps in the development of it would be, first of all, to update, refresh, and develop the metadata to include new forms of data which wasn't included in the initial scoping of our data. So we've already done some scoping work. So, so suggestions of data include things like the tenancy deposit scheme and safe deposit schemes in Scotland, online advertising data, particularly for sort of private rental sector, for Zoopla, private landlord registration data, data around submarkets. And part of our idea here is actually to generate our own data. So we will be doing some work where we're generating submarket data. which we'll be releasing for free on the Data Navigator, and also data about rural data needs. A lot of the housing data tends to be biased towards urban areas, and so we do realise there's a slight rural deficiency, so we are looking at rural data needs. Like I've just mentioned, we want to add value to existing data, so we're not just going to be a portal which points to existing data. We are going to be producing some derived data ourselves, so housing submarkets would be one of them. We're looking at ways of producing repeat sales indices from land registry data, that's another one. So we're looking at ways we can actually add value to existing data and create new data products, which we'll release for free. And we're also looking at creating something called open data bundles. So there's lots of existing data. Quite often they're held by different organisations for different countries, different nations of the UK. And it'd be useful actually if you could just grab a bundle of the same sort of data for the different nations. So one thing we want to do is extract the open data from these different organisations and just rebundle it in a useful way and put it on the Data Navigator. And again, we'll be basing that on sort of user feedback and user needs. And also going forward, we'd like to look at ways of visualizing data in interesting ways. So this is some work I've been doing with another organisation called Wizard, which is in Wales, of visualizing data on a similar portal. And as I've got a sort of geography background, I'm quite interested in maps. So there's some mapping data there. There's the Welsh Index of Deprivation, the new version which came out yesterday. And also we're looking at sort of interesting graphics. So we've got radio plots on the bottom right of built up areas in Wales and different data there. Okay, so this is the landing page. As you say, as I've said before, we've kept it very simple and it's the beta version. There's ability to report any bugs, and there will be some bugs on it because it's still the beta version. What you do is you click the big blue button, which is Search Our Data Navigator. Okay, you do that, it brings you to essentially just the search page. And again, very simple, it's just a box which you type in a keyword search. So type in something, I'm going to type in private rent as a search term for housing data. Click OK, and then it should bring in data that's stored the metadata that's stored in our database. So here we have a variety of data relating to private rent. We've kept the output simple, so we've kept the start date, the date the data was collected, the geographic coverage. So as I've mentioned, housing is a devolved policy area. So different nations in the UK tend to collect their own data sets. So some data is available for the whole of the UK. Other data sets might only be available for Wales or Northern Ireland or for England. And then a description of the data. And then ability to view the data. Okay, so for instance, I might want to click on the private rents for the Wales on view. And yes, it's crashed. So much for doing a live demo. I'll choose another one just in case it was just that one. Okay, it's not playing with me today, unfortunately, but what you would have got is the breakdown of the screen here. So you would get something like is it coming up? No. There. Yeah, so it would come up with something like that. I've shown it before. So that's what the private rental market statistics would look like, and it'll give you what it is. The release presents the mean, median, lower quartile total monthly rent paid for bedroom categories. It'll give you a link to actually where the data is, so you can actually grab the data. and it gives you some information about the data and the type of access. So do that for all the different types of data sets once it's working. So find out what's going wrong there. And as you can see there, and you can go back and type other searches as well. So for tenure. So we've put a lot of keywords in to do with housing. So with housing, it's not just housing that's important, neighbourhood's important too. So there's quite a lot of, there's quite a few data sets to do with neighbourhood as well as housing. Okay. So what I'll do is I will probably stop the, in terms of feedback as well, there's a feedback button if you want to give us some user feedback. Feedback form here, you can fill it in. And that will help us as well. And it asks you whether you want to be put on a user list as well for updates. So that's very useful if you could fill that in. So what I'll do is I'll just end the sort of presentation there and we'll go over to questions, I think. Is that okay, Sasha?
That's perfect. So thank you very much. So please feel free to leave a question in the chat box so we can see them. If you click down on the chat, you can see the chat. So there's already some chat going on there. So please feel free to leave a question there if you have any questions about how to connect it to your own work or research, for example, or if you have more general questions about the Data Navigator. So just sort of to get the ball rolling, I would like to start with the question myself. I was just wondering, what was your what were the biggest challenges in creating this Data Navigator for you?
Actually, one of the biggest challenges is knowing what users want. Actually, and knowing what data is useful. There is a lot of housing data out there. It's collected by different organisations. So there's official data, and we can probably list several data sources straight away. But what we want to know is identify the data sources which aren't really being used, which are quite useful. So actually, it's identifying those data sources which aren't that well known, and finding out how useful they are. So it's trying to, like any of these sort of things, it's trying to create something that's useful to other people. So I could create something that's useful for me. It's easy to do, but it's what's useful for other people, which is why we've tried to launch something quite early to get feedback as early as possible, so we can then develop the site around users' needs.
Right, very good, thank you. I've got a question coming in from Alexandra Rogers, which is what kind of timetable are you working towards when expecting the dashboard to go live?
Well, we're going to try to start working on the dash. I assume you mean the sort of visualization side of it. We're going to try and start working on it next year, as in 2020, with some very basic data sets. We've got some data sets from land registry on repeat sales, and we've got some other sort of other basic data sets on private rental sector. So we just want to develop a very basic dashboard around those type of things, particularly around local housing markets. So instead of just developing a general dashboard, which is so general that no one uses it, and again, that's always an issue of doing these sort of things, we're going to design it around particular types of data and uses. And one thing that came out of the Tobin process, which was a big scoping process CaCHE did last year, one was more information needed on the private rental sector, and other one was more information on the local housing market. So those are the two types of data we're going to be looking at in terms of the sort of dashboards.
Great, thank you. So I have another question, which is about comparing data sets across the UK. So how can you tell which data sets are comparable? For example, if you have homelessness statistics in Northern Ireland, how can you know whether they are comparable to Scotland, for example?
Yes, we're developing a wiki to run alongside the Navigator, and the wiki, hopefully the wiki will be updated by users, and that'll be a platform to explain, define concepts and explain how comparable or not data from the different nations are, by getting sort of expert users to actually work on the wiki. So there's been interest actually from a number of organizations about the idea of having a wiki like this. So it's not just homelessness data, it's things like the housing condition survey data, which came out recently for the 4 nations. And they are slightly different. The definitions are used, it's slightly different, and some of the variables are slightly different. And there has been done some work on how you can compare them. So it'll be using the wiki as a platform to start adding some depth to some of the data, particularly in terms of how things like comparability and how you can use it, which goes beyond the sort of general metadata about coverage and how old it is and who owns it. So we're having to look at that. So that's a sort of separate project.
Right, thank you. There's a more practical question. It says, when do you expect the bugs will be fixed to allow us to plan a return?
Oh, hopefully as soon as possible when we find out what it is. I think it's probably related to the security bug. I think it's probably a patch or something that needs to be updated. So hopefully not too long. It's like one of these things. It's, you know, if you don't update a part of the software, it stops working, and quite often the updates come at irregular times because we're using open source software. So yeah, as soon as possible, we'll try and get it fixed.
Right, thank you. There's a question from Robbie Bryden at McMaster University in Canada, who is asking, will you build in a browse function identifying the major categories of information on the front page?
Ooh. A browse function. Oh, yes, okay. We'll build in a browse. Oh, yes, sorry, yes. So we will be, I see what you mean, yes, definitely. We'll be categorizing, or we have categorized all the data sources, and that categorization will be on the front page to allow you very quickly to drill into the data, so you don't have to just use the search function. But yes, we will be developing the front page a bit more than just the welcome page. So that's something we're planning to do, and it's something quite easy we can do as well. So yeah, we will be putting a little bit more information on the front of what the catalogue looks like and the different themes in the catalogue.
Right, thank you. So another question is more maybe a suggestion. Are you aware of the Connected Open Government Statistics Project, formerly the GSS Data Project? And are you looking to work with this project to port data from official sources?
Yeah, we are in dialogue with people working on the GSS Data Project. I'm lucky that I'm in Cardiff, and the people working on the project just down the road in Newport, about 20 miles away. So I do have meetings with them in their offices. So I am aware of what they're doing. It's interesting. The white paper on land and housing statistics was published at the same time that CaCHE was launched, and housing statistics and land statistics suddenly became very important in terms of the ONS and the GS government statistics. So we're sort of running in parallel, and what I don't want to do is reinvent the wheel and repeat what they're doing. And so I'm sort of waiting for them. I'm sort of working alongside them and just to make sure that we don't do anything which they're doing, and vice versa. And as they've got more resources, obviously we're allowing them to sort of go ahead, but we're on dialogue with them, and they're aware of what we're doing. What they're interested in is our sort of coverage across the 4 nations, and the fact that we're in dialogue with the different organisations in the 4 nations, and the platform cuts across the 4 nations as well, which is something they're looking at. There's a big program on harmonisation of data across the 4 nations. So we're just being aware of that and making sure that we complement each other. So yes, we are aware of that.
Great. So there's another question from Jamie asking, are there any gaps in data sets and is work underway to fill these gaps?
Yeah, with housing data, there does tend to be gaps. A lot of it's, the gaps a lot of the gaps are geographical. So there's some data, really rich data sources in Scotland, which you can't get for England and Wales, and vice versa. Or the data's available, but it tends to be at quite a large aerial unit, and it's very difficult to drill down to a finer scale. So there's always going to be the sort of geographical gaps. One thing we can do with the Data Navigator and the metadata we've got in there is actually do some analysis of it, of the data, and actually identify those gaps in a slightly more systematic way, and that's something we're wanting to do. And then look at ways that those gaps could be filled, whether from alternative data sources or working or just advising organizations who collect data that there might be a gap, an important gap. But there's always going to be gaps in data, even if it's just a temporal gap. So one thing we want to do is actually do some analysis of the metadata to actually identify those gaps more formally.
Right. So I would like to still invite people to ask their questions or to leave suggestions as well. So Dean Robinson, for example, suggested that a recently added / updated would also be useful.
Yes. So one of the next stages is to refresh the metadata and identify the next. Some of the surveys have waves every year, so putting the next wave in, or identifying new data sets and actually maybe having a flag to see when it's been updated. So yes, it's the sort of thing which is ongoing and doesn't end with data, with metadata. So it's one thing we're trying to do is trying to keep on top, particularly the main data sets. It's impossible to have all the data sets in there, but the key data sets to make sure that the database is updated on that.
Great. So going back to the comparability issues that were raised earlier, Alexandra Rogers is asking, are you looking to have data producers edit the content in Wiki, or are you doing that yourselves?
Well, we want it to be like a wiki, so we do want external people to be able to edit it. We'd have editorial control, so we'd make sure that what's being edited is correct, and but we haven't got the resources really to edit it ourselves, particularly when it starts growing. So the idea would be to get the data producers to input into that wiki. And we'll see how it goes. It might be very successful, it might not, or we might just have it for particular popular data sets where comparisons, where people want to use comparisons and they need more information. So we'll have to just see how it goes. We're not quite sure the scope of it, and we're hoping it's going to be successful. We're hoping people are going to get behind it and add to it. But if they don't, we're just going to have to make sure it's just for key data sets, and then we'd have to do that. So we're at the stage where we're sort of finding out.
Right. So I'm not seeing any new questions. If you have more questions, please feel free to leave them. We will make an overview of all the questions asked. So even if you have questions afterwards, feel free to send them, and we will sort of include them in the overview. Also, again, if you have suggestions for any features or data sets that you would like to have included in the Data Navigator, feel free to also leave that as a suggestion. It could be very helpful to see what people are actually looking for on top of what's already there. So I just wanted to leave some space. Do you have any more questions, Scott, for the people who are listening
in? Just fill in the online form with your details, and you could email us as well, questions and things after the webinar, and we do have a mailing list if you want to sign up to it and get involved. As I said, the success of things like the data portal and the wiki depends on external contribution, external engagement. So we're hoping, for people to sort of leave us feedback so we know how to develop it. for it to be useful to users.
Right, and could you please remind us where we can find this online for?
Yeah, if you go to the CaCHE Data Navigator, there should be a link at the top which says feedback, and click on that and you go to an online form. So just click on the feedback button at the top of the navigator.
Great, thank you. So then another question is asking, how are you going to evaluate the quality of the data set?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it probably initially will be by the data provider. So if it's a data provider which has a history of providing good data such as the national data providers, we can use that. I know that some of the GSS project is looking at data quality and data quality standards and giving some sort of quality mark about their data. So we'll be working with them really, and using their sort of standards. That might become a bit of an issue for the sort of new forms of data, which isn't necessarily survey data. So for instance, the advertising data from Zoopla or something like that, which wouldn't necessarily conform to the sort of statistical standards from the ONS. So we would have to sort of think about how we would evaluate that, but that's slightly a bit of an academic piece of work, which is why CaCHE would be quite a good place to be able to do it. So yeah, it depends upon what form of data it is, and if it's government survey data, then we will be relying on the sort of the data providers to have some sort of data standard.
Thank you. So I would like to leave a little bit room for people who have questions or who are formulating questions right now. Very welcome to still enter them in the chat. I was wondering, I was very interested in the sort of data visualization function as a possible next step. Could you tell a little bit more about what kind of different questions you could be sort of researching with that particular function?
Yeah, really, it's a way of deciding whether the data is useful for you. So we're hoping to have some sort of mapping function, mainly because even now people find it difficult to map data. It's still something that takes a little bit of technical expertise. And we've got some experience of producing quite straightforward mapping functions where you can map data. And also those sort of interesting visualizations. So I mentioned the radial plots. Again, it's just a way of summarizing data effectively, so people get a broad overview. Obviously, if you want to do research, then you'll be able to sort of download the data and put it into your own sort of research package, whether it's SPSS or R or Stata. But the dashboard's really to give you an overview of the data sets. And quite a lot of time, that's what people want at the start, is an overview to decide whether or not the data is going to be useful for them. If it's going to be a particular data set or particular data bundles, for instance, around local housing markets, we might put some more specific functionality in there and produce a sort of tool in its own right. But for sort of more general data sets, it'll just be sort of high-end visualizations, just to give an overview of what the data's about.
Right, so very excited to see that. So Chris Worthington is asking, what are the main data sets for the private rented sector?
It varies by nation, and I'm tempted to say have a look on the data portal because I can't remember them offhand. There's a variety of data sets on things such as security of the deposit, on rents, on the local housing allowance, on quality, and there's actually more data sets being published as we're going forward. It does vary by nation, and it does vary by geographic coverage as well. So I would suggest have a look at the data portal, see what we've got at the moment. the situation is quite fluid, it is changing.
So the final question, I think, but still feel free to leave more questions, but there's one more about the users. So when you're thinking of sort of which users are going to be needing the Data Navigator, what kind of level of personal knowledge are you aiming the content at?
We're aiming, well, we want a wide variety of users to use it. So the Navigator itself, we're trying to keep it quite basic. So you're not necessarily having to have a lot of knowledge to actually use the Navigator. In terms of data analysis, again, it depends what you want to do. We are looking at maybe putting on some basic provision of sort of training of how to use data sets. But for the actual Data Navigator and also any sort of dashboard, it'd be quite straightforward. We're looking at sort of nothing too complicated. So it was not necessary for the specialist, but I think the specialist already knows what data they want and how to analyze it.
So I've got a question from Andrew saying, will the data set have anything on fitness for habitation and compliance with minimum housing fitness standard?
If that data becomes available, then yes, it will do. So we are sort of horizon scanning what data is coming online and then adding it in. So yeah, so anything like that, particularly those things about, you know, which have links to the private rented sector and health and well-being, then yes, we're interested in those.
Thank you. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to type them here. I think, will the data be age related is a question from Kennedy.
What does that, do you mean as in a person's age or historic data? I mean, historic. Yes, I thought, yes, okay. Again, if it's available, so for instance, some of the house price data goes back to the 90s. Some of the census data in the UK, we can go back to the 1960s now at certain particular levels. And in the 60s, there was a lot more housing data collected than there is today because there was a lot of real problems with housing quality then. So we will be looking at historic data, but only if it's deemed to be useful. What we don't have is a lot of resources to digitize data, old data sets. I know some people in CaCHE have done some really, really interesting work looking at spatial fixes and looking at how problem neighborhoods today in terms of poverty can be linked back to when they were built 150 years ago. And there's certain elements, so certain data from 150 years ago correlates well with poverty today. And if you look at the reasons why is to do with how it was built, when it was built, and the sort of gentrifications happened since. That's really interesting, but it's taken a long time to get that data together. So yeah, historic data is fascinating, and we'll try to get as much as possible, but only if it's easy to do, because we haven't got the resources to digitize it.
I think we're slowly coming to an end of the webinar.
Yeah.
I wanted to thank you all very much for participating and for actively asking questions and for attending the webinar. I wanted to thank you very much, Scott, for a fascinating presentation. So this meeting has been recorded. We probably will look at how to edit it and perhaps look at a little sort of user guide and place it on the website. So please keep an eye on the CaCHE website, on the CaCHE Twitter account, and just look for updates because we will follow up from this. So thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you very much. We will let you know once the recording is available. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.